So let's look at what it means for an action potential to occur. So in the grand scheme, if we were to look at a chart conveying voltage potential versus time, so we're going to look at voltage in millivolts, and we're going to look at potassium. So we're going to also be looking at this in terms of milliseconds. So now initially what will happen is we're going to see that it's going to stay at negative 75 millivolts, which we found out that that's related to potassium's equilibrium value. And then what will happen is we have a stimulus being applied that's going to allow it to reach threshold. And then once the stimulus has reached the maximum output, we're going to have depolarization occurring. And once everything is fully reached, now we're going to occur with repolarization, leading to hyperpolarization and returning back to the equilibrium. So let's look at this with, as a labeled chart. So this is where we had the stimulus being applied. We reached threshold. This period right here that we see is considered overshoot. And this area right here is hyperpolarization, so I'm going to switch my colors. So we have right here, this is depolarization. Right here is where the cell repolarizes, or the membrane I should say, and this is what's known as after hyperpole. But this area specifically right here is where we have hyperpolarization. So now let's look at what each one of these means. So the threshold itself is the critical value of the membrane potential, meaning that this is that critical point that when we have a little bit more of a stimulus, it's going to allow for an all or none process. It's kind of like shooting a gun. If we have our finger on the trigger and we're pulling it back a little bit, nothing's going to happen. But the moment that you pull the trigger a little bit more and the spring releases and causes the firing, in the case of the analogy, we have an action potential. So we've cocked back the gun and now we've just fired it. And so the firing allows for depolarization, which, if you remember, depolarization, the word D means not, so we're going to have not as much of a negative, we're going positive, so it's depolarizing the cell. And this is going to be a reduction of the membrane potential from resting value towards zero. So we're reducing the membrane potential, meaning that we're becoming less negative and more positive until we've gone to the point that we've completely fired the potential. Once we reached, or we've overshot, now the cell wants to come back to normal, so it's going to repolarize. And repolarizing would be that we're going to go back to the more negative value. Going beyond the equilibrium value, we're going to hyperpolarize, meaning that we become more negative, hyper meaning more, negative from the resting membrane potential. And so there are two concepts to know. One is absolute refractory period versus relative refractory. So our absolute, as it sounds, anything that's absolute would mean that we can't fire again until we return back to our normal. So until the gates are all closed, open, ready to go, that's the only way we're able to fire again. Now, relative refractory, on the other hand, if things are relative, that means that they're close enough. So with relative, it's allowing that we can fire again, but we have to have a high enough stimulus to allow us to have that firing occur. So just keep in mind that the difference between absolute versus relative, if you have a high enough stimulus, you can allow for firing to occur a second time. Absolute means that we cannot until everything returns back to normal. So now let's look at what the sodium membrane looks like. So the sodium membrane itself, or sorry, sodium channel, if we were to look at it, basically what we have is a channel that is comprised of two gates. And the gates are what's going to allow this channel to basically control what passes through and at what point we're going to have sodium ions being able to pass through. So now if we look at this channel right here, we have this kind of ball right here, and this is actually the inactivation gate. And this right here is the activation gate. So the inactivation gate, if we're looking at resting, what we're going to see is, and I'm going to write this sort of as a table, we're going to have the activation gate and inactivation gate. So in the case of being at rest, what happens is both of these gates are closed. So we see that the activation gate is closed, and same with the inactivation gate. And I know I've drawn it weird here, and it'll kind of clear up in a little bit. Now, whenever we want to come to an active state, we're going to see something different. And as you probably guessed, an active gate would mean that everything is open, ready to go. And that is exactly what we're going to see here. In the active state, the gate is open, and we have the ability to allow sodium ions to pass through. So now in terms of our gates, everything is open. But now let's look at the last step. So now we're at inactivation. So being in inactivation, what's going to happen here is, if we're going to look at this membrane, we're going to see that the inactivation gate is actually closed. But our activation gate is open. Well, being that the inactivation gate is closed, we cannot have anything passing through. I mean, we have some ability for leak. but it's still going to be, you're going to have a lot of pressure to allow it to work and open. So this is what the sodium channel is going to look like when we're looking at an action potential. So in general, if we're going to look at what sodium and potassium are doing, we have to think back to the other graph. So if we're looking at this graph right here, at the resting state, which is this right here, we're going to see that the activation gate is closed and the inactivation gate is open. But this is going to allow sodium leak to occur. So we're going to have, potassium leak. So we're going to have some potassium coming through. Now that we have depolarization on the other hand, so this point where we're going up, we now have the sodium channels open, the activation gates are open. The sodium ions can pass through the open channels down the electrochemical gradient into the neuron, leading to depolarization to reach threshold. Now that we've reached threshold, we're going to have some way to allow more ions to come in. So we're going to have explosive regeneration of the activation of sodium channels. So now we have sodium channels completely opening up. It's going to allow for rapid depolarization of the nerve membrane. And this is because of that inward flux. So if we kind of think back to here, now that we have a lot of sodium coming in, the gates are open. Now imagine multiple of these gates are open. We're allowing a lot of sodium to come in, and as a result of having all these plus charge ions coming in, we're going to see that we're going from a less negative environment to a more positive environment. And then what happens is when we have too much positive on the inside or in the intracellular, we have to find some way to return it back. Now the potassium channels, they're going to slowly open up. They're a slower channel in relationship to the sodium channels. The sodium channels are going to be fast open close. It's kind of like having a door that can open and close by the flash versus having a door that opens and closes with a sloth. The sloth is going to take its sweet time to open and close the door. So remember that a sloth is closer to a potassium channel versus the sodium channel is more like the flash. And the flash is going to want to make sure that it gets from point A to point B relatively quick and not allowing problems to occur, because we don't want too much sodium inside the cell. So now that we have this positive potential, we're going to have these sodium channels close and the inactivation gate close. The voltage-gated potassium channels are opening, they're slowly opening, and now this is going to bring the membrane potential back to a more negative environment. So now if we look back here, what happened is we're still allowing some sodium to pass. It's very little that can pass, but on the potassium side, the channel is fully open, and it's that sloth that's opening it up. And because the sloth is taking its sweet time to close everything, too much potassium comes in, leading to hyperpolarization. And so there is this positive potential that's going to occur. And then now the potassium channels are going to close, and we're going to go back to our resting state. So that's basically what is going to happen. Now let's kind of look at it schematically, or I should say as a quick table. So if we're thinking about it, we've got our sodium channels, and we've got our potassium channels. And then we have the resting, and at resting, the sodium channels are going to be at resting state. And the potassium are some are going to be open. Now when we want to reach threshold, we're going to have a partial activation. And if you remember, this is where we see that the sodium gates are starting to open up, and we're allowing some of the sodium ions to come in to give more of a positive state. Now for once we hit action potential, we have full activation, meaning that we're completely open. So our sodium channels are completely open. We're having a rush of sodium coming in, becoming more positive in terms of the membrane. And now what's happening is the potassium channels are having more of them opening up. And this is to control how positive the membrane gets. And then now that we go to repolarization, what we're going to find is that the sodium channels are going to be in an activated state, meaning that the sodium channels, the inactivation gate is now closed, even though the activation gate is still open. In terms of potassium, we have it fully open now. So remember, potassium is a sloth, so at first it needs a little bit of help to have some of them open. Then he's slowly opening up the door a little bit more, and now we're in repolarization. The sloth has fully opened up the doors. And then when we get into hyperpolarization, the sodium channels, they're going back to the resting state. So what will happen is it's fully inactive, meaning that back in this state where everything was closed, and this is going to allow for, this is going to put it in an absolute refractory period, meaning that we can potentially go back to normal, or sorry, we can go back to a point where we can have the next action potential occurring. Now, in terms of the potassium, the sloths have gotten tired, so they're going to close our potassium channels. And this is going to allow for our next action potential to occur. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense, kind of seeing what's happening to each of these channels. So now, the other thing that we should know is, in terms of the axon, so we know that an axon is basically like this little, if we're doing a cross-sectional view, it's kind of like this little piece of tissue, and some of them are going to be myelinated, which is going to make it look kind of fatty. And what this myelination does, it's going to increase the velocity for that transmission. So if we have a bit of current going, and we're looking at this myelinated axon, what's going to happen is this fat is going to, this fatty coating or this fatty myelin is going to allow for the conduction. So as these electrical impulses come, it's going to allow for an increased conduction. And so that's going to allow for faster transmission of that stimulus down the axon. The other thing is, if we were to compare the axon itself, and we're to look at two different axons, so like this is the axon of a squid versus, our axon. The squid's axon is very large, and so it has a large diameter, and if we think about it in terms of water, if I were to shoot water down this axon, my limitation in terms of my velocity is the diameter of that pipe. So if we have a really small pipe, it may seem that the water is moving fast, but the amount of water that's passing is not that much. Same thing happens with this. If we have a larger diameter, it's going to allow for greater transmission or more information to pass through. So it's increased velocity because we have a larger diameter. So the two things that are going to decide how fast an action potential goes down the axon is, one, if it's myelinated or unmyelinated. If it's unmyelinated, we don't have the salt-stir conduction that we see. We're not going to have as fast of transmission. And the second is the diameter of the axon. A larger diameter means faster transmission. Well, if you have any questions about the video, comments, please leave them below. I have my notes in the captions section, so if you want to download them, you can. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel.